Hello and welcome to the Better Futures Forum. My name is Dan Illich. I'm your host for this session, which is very exciting, very exciting. I think I've been your host for the whole thing. That's what it says on my script right here. I encourage you to use the chat feature on your right-hand side of your screen. Please share your research, links, thoughts on this session topic there. Also, we've got a Q&A function on that same side as well. So if you've got questions for our guests this afternoon, please hit them up in the Q&A section there. Write your questions down, and then the team are going to feed it to me as we go through our interview a little bit later on this afternoon. And if you need to contact our events team or tech support or navigate or tech support or just navigate to the inbox at the top of your screen and search event support for instant chat. Okay, let's get on to the show with our speakers today. We've got one pre-recorded and one live. First, to start off, I want to introduce to you Alok Sharma. Alok Sharma is certainly no stranger to anyone who follows British politics. He's served as Secretary of State Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, but right now he's got a pretty important role. He has one of the most pressure cooker jobs in the world. He is the president for COP26, and whether or not we have a successful COP sits largely on his shoulders. So it is an absolute privilege to hear a message from him right now.
Greetings to you all, and thank you to the Better Future Forum for inviting me to join you today. Friends, all around the world, extreme weather is on the march. Extreme weather made much more likely by the emissions that we humans are pumping into the atmosphere. Last year, Australia saw wildfires rage. Last month, a month's worth of rain fell in London in just 24 hours. 2021 has seen devastating floods surge through China, India, and Western Europe. And what is truly concerning is that the window of time that we have to prevent these effects getting far, far worse is closing fast. In 2015, the countries of the world signed the Paris Agreement, and they agreed to do all they could to limit the rise in global temperatures to well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5 degrees. Because the science said this would avoid the worst effects of climate change. But since the Paris Agreement was signed, the world has not done nearly enough. And that is shown very clearly by the recent report by the IPCC, as indeed was the fact that if we do not act now, that 1.5 degree target will slip out of reach. So COP26, the critical United Nations climate conference that we're going to be hosting in Glasgow in November, must be the moment that every country and every part of society embraces their responsibility to protect our precious planet. And each of us has a role to play. And now, with around 70 days left before COP26, we're pushing harder than ever for all of society to take action around 4 key goals. Firstly, to put the world on a path to driving down emissions until they reach net zero by the middle of this century. And this is vital to keeping the 1.5 degree target within reach. And we're asking all countries to make solid net zero commitments for the middle of the century and short-term emissions reduction targets to take them there. The major economies, the big emitters, are absolutely critical, and I urge Australia to step up with big, bold commitments ahead of COP26 in November. Our second goal is to protect people and nature from the effects of climate change, effects that are already being experienced around the world, and particularly in those communities that have done the least to cause the crisis. I've seen this myself in Ethiopia and Nepal, in the Caribbean. And I'm determined that COP26 will deliver for those communities. So we're encouraging action to protect people and nature and to ensure funds are available to do so. And this brings me to our third goal, finance. Without adequate finance, the task ahead is near impossible. So we're working to get funds flowing to climate action, both public and private money, including persuading developed countries to deliver the $100 billion a year that they have promised developing countries to help them respond to the climate crisis. And our final goal is working together. And that includes working with civil society, with businesses, with young people, with faith communities, and indigenous peoples to deliver our COP26 goals. Because ultimately, we all have a role to play. We need business and finance to drive change across the real economy and to demonstrate to governments that the private sector supports climate action by joining the United Nations Race to Zero campaign and committing to reach net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. And we want financial institutions to join the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero campaign. Over $80 trillion worth of assets have already committed to net zero under this campaign. The knowledge of indigenous peoples will be key in protecting our planet and its extraordinary biodiversity. And we need civil society to also build support for strong government policy, hold leaders to account, and help represent frontline communities. And this is vital. And I'm determined that all voices will be heard loud and clear at COP26. And indeed, this is why we established the Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council to help shape the summit. And it's why we're supporting a mentoring initiative to help women participate in climate negotiations. And it's why we are supporting an Indigenous Peoples Pavilion at COP26 itself, a space for knowledge sharing, for discussion and ceremony. Friends, the clock is ticking. Time is running out. There are just around 70 days left to COP. So let's make every one of them count. Let's all play our part in making the goals of the Paris Agreement a reality, building a fairer, cleaner, and greener future for us all.
Oh, strong words there from Alok Sharma. Yes, Australia should step up with big, bold commitments heading into COP26. Indeed. All right. Now, well, we've all been kind of anticipating this moment of the program. You may have read in this morning's papers about what our next guest has planned for us this afternoon. It's the Honourable Chris Bowen, Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy. Chris is going to share with us how Labor would like to see Australia approach the COP26 negotiations in Glasgow in less than 3 months' time, and more importantly, what Australia's climate action agenda should look like. And forgive him, he hasn't had a haircut in 5 weeks. It's Chris Bowen. Take it away.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. And I'm joining you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Darug Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. There are plenty of policy challenges in Australian public life at the moment. More than half the country's in lockdown, and my own community here in Fairfield has been feeling that acutely for weeks with no clear path out. And the international geopolitical situation has had plenty of shoals, and as we've seen tragically in Afghanistan, these challenges have consequences for millions of people. But even in this crowded field, we have to continue to lift our ambitions and our efforts on climate change, which presents the most serious ongoing threat to our well-being. The IPCC report last week was simultaneously unsurprising and shocking. While it was shocking, it's important to remember it contained hope. It had both agency and urgency. That's to say, it's not too late to act, but we have to act quickly. Of course, as Alok Sharma just said, we're now less than 3 months from COP26 in Glasgow. Ahead of that conference, the focus is rightly on the current government. Like it or not, and I don't like it, only they will represent Australia in Glasgow, and only they can update our NDC this year. But we're also within months of a federal election, after which I hope to remove the word shadow from my title. And so today it's appropriate that I announce 4 key principles that will underpin the climate change policy that Labor will take to the election and the climate change program of an Albanese Labor government. Firstly, net zero emissions by 2050 is necessary but not sufficient. A strong roadmap to get there is important too. A commitment to net zero by 2050 is the essential starting point of good climate policy. Over 130 countries, every state and territory, and most of our businesses and industry groups share that end goal. It's frankly extraordinary that their government doesn't. It reveals that the Conservatives still see climate change as nothing more than a wedge to be managed in the party room and exploited in the body politic. In contrast, Labor's been committed to net zero by 2050 since 2015. Anthony Albanese recommitted to the target in one of his first acts as opposition leader. But while a commitment to net zero by 2050 is necessary, Labor understands it's not sufficient. If we want to achieve net zero in 2050, we can't begin in 2049 for two reasons. Firstly, decarbonisation of the global economy is the greatest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution. In Australia, that transformation will take time, and the longer we leave it, the harder it will be to take advantage of the opportunities. Secondly, and most importantly, the extent of warming will be determined by aggregate emissions over the next 3 decades, not just those in 2050. It's 6 years next month since Tony Abbott was deposed as Prime Minister. Tony Abbott is, of course, a climate change denier. His most consequential impact on Australian policy was to wreck and reverse climate action. But 2 Prime Ministers later, we're still saddled with the emissions reductions target of this climate wrecker, 26 to 28% below 2005 levels by 2030. Our target now pales into comparison when we look at similar countries like Canada at 40 to 45%, Japan at 46%, and the United States at 50%. And of course, there are reasons to doubt that we'll even meet our already inadequate target. And even if we do, the bulk of the reductions were under the former Labor government and as a result of policies by them. As a country, we like to punch above our weight, but in this regard, we're not even doing our fair share. Australia's emissions matter. We're amongst the highest per capita emitters in the world. Reactionaries who argue we only represent a small share of global emissions miss a fundamental point. We're the world's 14th biggest emitter. That's to say there are 176 countries who emit less than us. Are we really going to argue that the burden of climate action must fall on the 13 countries that are larger emitters than us, but not the 177 countries that emit the same or less than us? These 177 countries account for 33% of global emissions. It's a patently ridiculous argument. And while the government blames China and India for its own inaction, Australia will only persuade others to take stronger action when we get our own house in order. Penny Wong and I would like to see advocacy of stronger climate action as a key pillar of Australian foreign policy under a Labor government. But we could only do that if we lift our own ambitions and, importantly, our own achievements. We've seen even today the US Deputy Special Envoy for Climate Change telling this forum this morning that it would be, and I quote, really helpful to see Australia move forward with a more ambitious effort. The Prime Minister said last week that the government will be updating what we expect to achieve in 2030 when the Glasgow summit is held. Good. I'll hold him to it. Australia should take a higher medium-term target to COP26 in November. It should be informed by the climate science and by the economics of what we need to do now to get to net zero by 2050. Our second principle is that ambition must be backed by policy. As I've said, ambition matters. But policies to achieve that ambition matter even more because targets are meaningless unless they're achieved. That's why my first question when any emissions reduction target is posed is how. Now, to be clear, lest I sound like the current government on this point, let me be very clear. The coalition doesn't have real ambition nor policy. They use their lack of policy to justify their lack of ambition and vice versa. By way of contrast, an Albanese Labor government will deliver both. We've already begun to announce ambitious costed policies, like our $20 billion investment in transmission infrastructure to allow more renewables into the grid. Our abolition of inefficient taxes on low emissions vehicles that will put them within reach of more Australians without ending the weekend. Our investment in 400 community batteries around Australia to allow more solar homes to enjoy the benefits of storage. And Anthony and I will have much more to say over coming months. Those announcements will be guided by our third principle, that good climate policy is good jobs policy. We on the progressive side have tended to talk about climate action as an environmental imperative, as a moral necessity. And of course, we're right, climate mitigation is an urgent environmental priority. Australians know all too well that we are already experiencing more regular and severe natural disasters like bushfires, droughts and floods. One of the IPCC's more stark warnings was that intensity, frequency and duration of fire weather events are projected to increase throughout Australia. But all too often, to be completely honest, we've lost the economic argument for climate action, that it's in our national economic interest to act. Conservatives paint climate action as a trade-off with economic growth with workers to pay the price. Now, on the contrary, we must prosecute and win the argument that strong climate action is an imperative to underpin strong and shared economic growth in Australia in coming decades. It's clear now that the real economic risk is inaction, whether from carbon tariffs, the decarbonisation of global capital, or the physical impacts of climate change itself. Those market signals should be an important guide to the nature and pace of climate action. But the Coalition wants to use public money to invest in old technology because they don't care about climate change or higher power prices for consumers. And the Greens Party wants to end some industries immediately with little or no regard to the workers and communities impacted. Only Labor understands that governments should work with markets not only to reduce emissions, but to create jobs and national wealth. That's why I say at every chance, the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. That understanding that climate action can create jobs and cut power prices while reducing emissions drives our policy approach in each sector. Our commitment to new energy apprenticeships, for example, will support 10,000 young Australians to train them for the jobs of the future and help build the workforce we need to electrify everything. But the jobs of the future aren't just in generating and storing renewable energy. The jobs opportunities are right across our economy because renewable energy is not only clean, but it's cheap. It's also less centralised than our traditional energy sources, unlocking cheaper energy in more places. So we'll continue to announce policies that are good for workers, businesses and the community, as well as the environment. And as we do so, we'll be guided by the fourth principle, that the regions must be at the centre of our climate and energy policies. A handful of regions have powered Australia for decades, often in difficult and thankless circumstances. They deserve our deep respect for having done so. But as the global economy decarbonises over coming decades, they also deserve our support and our efforts to work with them, not foist our plans upon them. Happily, the regions that have always powered Australia are best placed to power us into the future because they have the best access to transmission lines and other vital infrastructure. They have the space necessary for large renewable and storage installations and the skilled workforces that understand energy generation. Take, for example, the battery manufacturers setting up shop in Townsville and Maryborough, or the hydrogen proponents investing in Gladstone. Or the fact that almost every Australian offshore wind proposal lies off the coast of a coal community because those regions are best connected to the electricity grid. But none of those proposals can currently proceed because the government's broken its promise to introduce a regulatory regime for offshore renewables. That's one symptom of a broader problem. The government simply refuses to waken the sleeping giant of regional and rural jobs that will be created by massive increases in electricity generation and use. Let me conclude by saying this. We all know how hard the climate wars have been in Australia. The toxic embrace of identity politics and division by our political opponents has seen meaningful action on climate change stymied for coming up to 2 decades. This must come to an end. As Matt Keane told this forum earlier this week, we simply must move beyond the false facts, fear and prejudice. With the world moving ahead of Australia and Australians moving ahead of their government, I think there's a unique opportunity to win the argument for climate action at the next election. That's because despite the inevitable scare campaigns, and they will come, the reality of opportunities of climate action is on our side. Now let me be very frank about how we win this argument. I'm sorry to say it won't be won by spraying graffiti and burning prams on the steps of Parliament House, nor will it be won with last-minute convoys of condescension. We've seen that movie before. It will be won by ambition and by the hard slog of respectful and consistent engagement with people who are concerned about the economic impact of climate action on their families and their regions. It will be won with a forward-looking and optimistic message about creating jobs and cutting power bills while reducing emissions. And it will be won with policy propositions that support the message consistent with the principles I've outlined today. So I look forward to working with everybody in the lead up to the next election and beyond. But most of all, I look forward to being Minister for Climate Change and Energy in an Albanese Labor government, a government with climate ambition and with the policies to make that ambition a reality. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. I've got a couple of questions for you. Would you believe?
Sure thing.
Yeah. Look, as you mentioned, Matt Keane at the start of this conference said those who are delaying climate change should get out of the way. Was that a direct challenge to Joel Fitzgibbon?
Oh no, I think he was aiming that fire at his own side there, Dan. I think that's what Matt was intending, and I think that's what the way it's been interpreted quite rightly. Now, I'll take your question head on. Yeah, sure. There's the odd debate on my side of politics as well. Not about net zero and not about the science of climate change, which the other side does engage in, but on our side. But very clearly, I make the recommendations to Shadow Cabinet and Caucus. I make the announcements, and with Anthony Albanese, and Anthony Albanese and I speak on behalf of the Labor Party when it comes to climate change and energy.
All right. And you did mention that it's time to put, bad faith politics behind us. But in your speech, you did say the Greens didn't have a plan for a just transition. But the Greens do have a plan for just transition for coal workers and people working in fossil fuels. Maybe you should. Have you thought about starting with yourself for moving those weasel words aside?
Oh, well, look, there are times when we can work with the Greens and times when we and the Greens are very opposed. And the Greens have a political business model, and I understand that business model. That's to try and replace Labor in various seats. That's their way forward. They campaign against Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese, and that's perfectly fine, of course. But their policies, in my view, aren't realistic, and they don't pay due heed to the very genuine and real concerns of people in regional Australia. That's really my fundamental point, Dan. We can win this argument, but we need to bring people with us, and we bring people with us with that optimistic view of Australia's future as a renewable energy powerhouse, one where we're investing in communities, helping communities through as the world decarbonises, honest about the future, but deeply respectful of those energy workers and their stake in the future as well.
You did say a few things. You set out your 4-point plan: policy, jobs, regions at the centre. The one thing you were a bit light on, though you had a lot of puff behind it, was a bigger ambition. If you were Minister for Climate Change at this point, what would our ambition be heading into COP26?
Well, I think I made it pretty clear, Dan, that I don't think the government.
No, you just said it was going to be bigger.
Yeah, well, I made clear that the current government's not ambitious enough. Now, as I said, only they can take a plan to Glasgow. Sure. I'd love to go to Glasgow. I won't be welcome. I won't get a visa. I have no role to play in Glasgow, so I can't take that. And obviously, Anthony and I will have plenty more to say before the election about our approach, but I'm laying out, I think, with respect, some pretty clear markers as to our thinking today.
You made a good point before, just then, saying that there are a lot of people behind climate action. People want to see climate action. And you did say that the Greens business policy is putting Labor out of business. But should you be worried more about independents who are agitating in swing seats, who are getting enormous traction behind them based around centred policy around climate change? Because Labor hasn't been strong enough on climate this time round.
No, I don't think that's not how I see it. And look, there are independents and independent movements and in areas that are doing good work, and good luck to them. In various seats, they're campaigning against climate change deniers. I know there's a strong movement, for example, in Hume, in Angus Taylor's electorate, vote Angus out, and good luck to them. They're doing good work. It's a matter of that they're proposing their policies and their way forward, and obviously, where we can, we also work with people like Zali Steggall, who comes to this discussion with good faith. And, she played a strong role in getting rid of Tony Abbott. And, I'm a political realist. The Labor Party was always a long shot in Warringah for us to take the seat. I campaigned for the Labor candidate there. He's a good fella, but he was always a long shot. So Zali Steggall plays a good role there too. And where we can, we'll work with her.
Inside the party, are people seeing other independents who clearly could probably take Liberal crowns from Liberal parties to turn to an independent? Would you ever back independents over Labor candidates in swing seats like that?
No. We'll always campaign for Labor candidates. We'll always work with Labor candidates. But, in those seats like Warringah, there are opportunities for progressives to come together in common causes, whether they be Labor, Green or independent. There are opportunities there, but I've been a member of the Labor Party now for 33 years, Dan, and I campaign for Labor candidates.
Sure, no worries. I campaign for comedians. That's what I do. Now, Joshua Danahay says, what will a Labor government commit to will Labor commit to no fossil fuel developments? Very similar to what Jacinda is doing in New Zealand.
Well, let me just talk about this in a couple of ways, because it's a big issue. Firstly, there will be no new coal-fired power stations in Australia, and no substantial new gas-fired power stations in Australia, because they both require government subsidies. And I don't support government subsidies for coal or gas-fired power stations. We're opposed to the Kurri Kurri gas-fired power station subsidy, for example. Only reason it's being built, if it proceeds, is that government subsidy. I know some people want a taxpayer-funded coal-fired power station in Queensland. Well, not if I have anything to do with it. These things won't happen with sensible policy. The transition that's underway, the movement is all in one direction. Now, when it comes to resource extraction, that's by and large a state matter. By and large, states will approve or disapprove of proposals. But again, the international market is heading in one direction. And so I think we're going to see that play out as well in Australia going forward.
I think your answer is going to be similar to this next question. The IEA recently reported that if we're able to avoid catastrophic climate change, there can be no new coal or gas. How does Labor's continuing support of gas square up with your ambition to step up with climate action in line with IPCC report? And what is your position on Adani/Baravis?
Well, let's deal with gas because it is an important topic that gets raised a lot. Now, the government says the gas-fired recovery. It's not true. There is no gas-fired recovery. There won't be a gas-fired recovery. It's a fraud. It's a fraudulent proposition. Having said that, gas will continue to play a role in the system for some time to come. I think I made pretty clear I'm very pro-renewables and very pro-renewable energy investment. I want to get to 100% renewables and beyond. I want Australia to be an export powerhouse of renewables. But at the same time, we're going to have to build the storage, the batteries, household, community and grid, the pumped hydro and the hydrogen to store it. Again, the Conservatives say the rain doesn't always fall and the sun doesn't always shine. Well, that's true, but it's about as sensible as saying the rain doesn't always fall. They say the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. That's about as sensible as saying the rain doesn't always fall, so we can't drink water. Well, we do drink water. We store it. We can store renewable energy as well. But while we're building that capacity, we're going to need peaking and firming. And the options for peaking and firming are nuclear. I'm against it. Coal, well, I've said what I think where the direction coal-fired power is heading, and gas. So out of those options, we're going to need some gas in the system. We also have some hard-to-abate sectors like cement building and brickworks. They're going to need gas for the foreseeable future. I hope that hydrogen steps forward and plays a bigger role, but that's some way off. So we have to be realistic about it. The Grattan Institute says 90% renewables, 10% gas. Maybe they're right about that. Maybe they're wrong about that. And the time frame to get there. But we are going to need gas in the system for peaking and firming as we build that storage capacity.
Right.
Batteries are good for the short term. Other things are better for the longer term, but they're going to take time to build.
Peaking and firming. I'm all about that, Chris. I'm all about peaking and firming. Lee Constable asks, what is Labor's 2013 emissions reduction target? I'm just going to revisit that because I think it's important. Come on, give us a number, Chris. Give us a number.
No, I'm not giving you a number today, Dan. I know you're a very good journalist as well as a fantastic comedian, but I'm not giving you a number today. But I am laying out, I think, pretty firmly.
Now, Chris, you just can't go around saying lies like that. I'm not a very good journalist and I'm not a very good comedian. So, we know you're a politician. All right. Chris, thank you so much. It's been an absolute privilege to hear from you and hear you put a flag in the ground for Labor's climate ambitions. I think we are heading into something, a very interesting time over the next 8 months. I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. And I do understand, Chris, that the Minister for Emissions Reduction was also invited to come upon this forum, but refused. He had other things to do.
Well, there's a surprise.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much for your time. Oh, there you go, Chris Bowen. Well, that was exciting, wasn't it? Now, don't forget, if you're posting about this forum, use the hashtags BetterFuturesAU and also Better Futures Forum. And now, at this point, we're going to move to our next plenary session where we'll have an opportunity to hear from Indigenous leaders. Now, in a moment, you're going to be zapped away to that session. If you miss it, don't worry. Have a look in the chat section. You'll see the link that you can pick up and move yourself over. Okay, so I'm going to leave you and the wonderful Kathy Eatok. We'll meet you on the other side for an excellent conversation with Pastor Ray Minikin, Janine Mohammed, Virginia Marshall, and I will see you at the end of the day to wrap this whole show up with the last forum. Thanks a lot.